All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a very special edition of Torah Studies. This is our January 1st, 2020 edition of Torah Studies, and it's wonderful to have all of you that are here joining us live, joining us. So it's unusual because, or a little bit different, I would say, because we are not in the typical setting, which is the Chabad house, but I'm broadcasting live from my house due to the holiday, and it's very special that we can still learn online, which is kind of cool. So thanks for technology. So this week's Torah portion is Vayigash, and Vayigash has one of the most dramatic openings of any Torah portion in the entire Torah. The focus of today's session is going to be on the reunion, the dramatic reunion between Joseph, and his brothers. And it's very important to understand the context of how we got here. So I would say that we're probably all familiar with the story, but it's important to just recap how we got here. Joseph was sold as a slave to Egypt by his brothers, and he ends up in Egypt, enslaved and framed for a crime that he hasn't committed, and ultimately he rises to become viceroy of Egypt. His advice is about the food, to have the food protected and saved up in the land during the years of plenty for the years of famine. Famine breaks out, his brothers come down to buy food, and of course at that point Joseph recognizes, as the Torah says, Joseph recognizes his brothers. They do not recognize him, and he begins to accuse them of being spies, and essentially he puts them through the ringer. He is able to facilitate an entire orchestration of events to the point where at the end of last week's Torah portion, Binyamin, the youngest son of Yaakov and his younger brother from his mother Rachel, Benjamin is incarcerated for a crime that he hasn't committed, stealing the goblet of Yosef, and that is the crime that he's accused of. That's the crime that Benjamin is thrown in prison for. And it's at this point that Yehuda, the brother who took responsibility for Benjamin, for Binyamin, it's that Yehuda now approaches Yosef, not knowing that it's Yosef, to demand Binyamin's release. And he basically essentially tells him, at this point, it's either kill or be killed. We will kill or will be killed, but we're definitely not leaving Benjamin behind. You know, it's one of the most incredible and dramatic stories in the Torah for a very simple reason, and there's a very simple idea here. And that is, we have a situation where there's a scenario in front of us, and it seems to be the worst. Imagine if you're the brothers. So you've innocently decided to buy food, and you want to bring food back to your father, back to your family. And you've come down to Egypt, and you're accused of being spies, and you're incarcerated, and then you're let go, and then Shimon is incarcerated, and then they're reunited. Benjamin comes down, and now at this point, Benjamin is being incarcerated. And you can imagine, if you're the brothers, you think this is the worst case scenario. There's no hope. We're in Egypt. We don't have any connections. We don't know anybody. We're being accused of these crimes that we haven't committed. And you can imagine there's a state of hopelessness here. The crazy thing is that as fierce as a problem that this is, in truth, when you know the truth, there's no issue. There's no problem. Because they're literally standing in front of their brother who only seeks their benefit and doesn't seek their harm. And by the way, the commentators explain that what is the benefit that Yosef saw for his brothers? It was very simply to allow them the opportunity to really do teshuvah, to have a similar scenario that they had 20 years prior, which is to sell out their brother. Here they have a chance to sell out, God forbid, Benjamin, but they don't. Yosef is giving them the chance to kind of replicate the scenario that they had 20 years prior, and now to make a different choice upon which their teshuvah will be complete. Because teshuvah, as the Rambam says, Teshuvah, real repentance, real change, personal change, means that you're given the same opportunity that you had before, an opportunity that you made a negative choice, but this time you choose a positive choice. Now you know that you're different. Again, the idea of teshuvah is not just that you're not committing the crime again or not committing the sin, because it could be that you don't have the opportunity or the opportunity is different. The real definition of teshuvah is that you have the same opportunity, you have the same motivation inside or the same temptation, everything is lined up, and yet you still make a different choice. That's what teshuvah is, and that's how you know that teshuvah is complete. So Yosef wanted to give his brothers the opportunity, once again, now 20 years later, to have the other son of Rachel, of Rachel, to have Benjamin, to have him incarcerated, and for them to be tempted to walk away and come back to the father and say, listen, we tried. There's only so much we can do. The viceroy kept him. There's, we would have loved to bring him back, but we can't. They didn't choose that. They're faced with that perhaps temptation, but this time they make a different choice. They make a better choice. Now we know that teshuvah is real. So again, my point here is very simply that sometimes in life we face problems, challenges, adversity that are so difficult that in our wildest imagination, we can't imagine how we'll get out of it. It's not like it's a little bit difficult or it's going to take a lot of hard work to get out of it. Sometimes you can't even imagine how it would be humanly feasible or even within the realm of possibility to get out of that challenge. And we can imagine that the brothers had exactly that thought, that notion in their minds. Imagine you are in Egypt, you're one of the 10 brothers, and Benjamin has been incarcerated. Yosef is as far as you know, Yosef doesn't exist anymore. He's been missing for 20 years. You're alone. Your brother's been incarcerated. You have no idea what to do. You have no one to turn to. You can't go back to your father because he needs Benjamin back with you. So what do you do? Where do you turn? And it's at moments like these that the Torah reminds us that it could be that the solution is literally right in front of you, to the point that there's not even a problem. If you would ask the brothers a moment before Yosef reveals himself to them, is there a problem here? They would say there's a huge problem, and we don't know how to get out of this problem. And in fact, we're going to fight to the death because we have no other option, because there's no other solution possible. And a moment later, Yosef reveals himself to them. That moment later is the moment where the brothers realize that there's not only is there not a problem, there never was a problem. They were speaking to the brother the whole time. The brother had only their best interest in mind, like I mentioned, only to bring them to a state of teshuvah, and therefore it was never at all a problem. So this is a little bit of a perspective on this opening story. Okay, so what I want to do is explore a little bit. I want to see how I can do this by sharing my screen. Let's see if there's a way to do this. Okay. I don't see it right now, but maybe we'll find it. Okay. All right. So in absence of sharing my screen, I am going to, I'll be reading some text. So if I can figure out a way how to share the screen, I'll share the screen and you all can follow along inside. If not, then you'll just listen and I'll read the text and we'll be able to learn that way together. Okay, so I want to focus on the moment in which Yosef reveals his identity to his brothers. Again, my point stands. The point is that here we have a situation where the brothers thought there was no solution and there was every solution. There wasn't even a problem. But let's see how Yosef breaks the news to the brothers. So I'm going to read the text. It's text 1a. If you have the Torah studies books, it's text 1a on page 176. If not, then you'll just listen to me read it. This is coming from this week's Torah portion, Vayigash, and it is chapter 45 of the book of Bereshit, the book of Genesis, verses 1 through 3. Okay, so listen, I'll read it right now. It says, Now Joseph could not bear all those standing beside him, and he called out, Take everyone away from me. So no one stood with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. The Torah tells us the first thing Yosef does is he clears the room. All Egyptians, anyone else out of the room, just my brothers with me. Again, the brothers don't know that it's him and that he knows that it's them. but he clears the room. Let's continue. And he wept out loud, so the Egyptians heard, and the house of Pharaoh heard. Torah then tells us that everyone hears his sobs, his weeping. It's heard far and wide, although he's cleared the room, but his tears are heard outside the room. And here is the critical verse. So listen up. It says, and Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still alive? But his brothers could not answer him because they were startled by his presence. So at this point is the dramatic, this is the point of the dramatic reveal. Yosef says, Ani Yosef ha'od avichai. I am Yosef. I am your brother Yosef. Is father still alive? And the Torah tells us, what was the response of the brothers? What did the brothers say? The answer is nothing. Absolutely nothing. The brothers are silent. They're stunned into silence. They cannot speak whatsoever. They're so astonished and flabbergasted, just blown away. Just, they can't imagine that the person they've been dealing with for months, who's given them a hard time, who's the viceroy of Egypt, who they were afraid of, is their long-lost brother Yosef. So the Torah tells us that when he asks them, or when he tells them, I am Yosef, is my father still alive, or is father still alive? They don't even have anything to say. They can't say anything because they are so astonished and startled by him, by him being there. Okay, so let's continue with text 1b. This is Bereshit chapter 45, text 4 through 7. Here we go. So the brothers don't respond, so Joseph continues. Then Joseph said to his brothers, please come closer to me. He calls them close. And they drew closer. And he said, your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. But now do not be sad, and let it not trouble you that you sold me here. For it was to preserve life that God sent me before you. For already 2 years of famine have passed in the midst of the land, and for another 5 years there will be neither plowing nor harvest. And God sent me before you to make for you a remnant in the land and to preserve it for you for a great deliverance. And here with these words, Yosef is not only revealing his identity once again. You notice he reiterated those words. He says, I'm your brother Yosef, whom you sold into Egypt. Not only does he reiterate that he is indeed Joseph, but he says to his brothers, and you have nothing to be sad or troubled about. Don't be sad. Don't be troubled. Why? Because God sent me here to provide for you. What he's essentially telling them is, I'm holding no grudge against you. I don't have any ill intent. I'm not angry at you. And don't feel bad. Don't feel bad. Yes, you sold me as a slave into Egypt, or you sold me as a slave and I ended up in Egypt already going on 20 years ago. Nonetheless, it all worked out. It was God's plan, and I'm here to support you. Can you imagine? It's an unbelievable flip of the script. So not only is this person standing in front of them, this viceroy of Egypt, not only is it Yosef, but this is the same Yosef that they had ill intent regarding, and it's the same Yosef that holds no grudge, that has no animosity toward these very same brothers. Okay, so this is the story of Yosef's reveal. Yosef's reveal. We might say that this was the masked viceroy reality show. This is Yosef revealing himself to his brothers, and that's how it goes down. But every story in Torah has a timeless lesson. Every story in Torah is not just narrative about something that happened to individuals going on 3,500 years. Rather, in addition to that, now that's also true, right? Because every verse has its simple meaning, and these were literal characters who lived, and these happenings happened to them. But every story in Torah is also a spiritual lesson for you and I. In fact, as we've said many times in our classes, Torah is related to the word Horah, which means lesson. Torah is a teaching, a life manual, a life instruction book, which means that if we're just studying Torah as narrative, if we're just studying this week's Torah portion, and all we're taking away from it is a story that happened 3,500 years ago with a fellow named Joseph and his brothers and Benjamin and Jacob and Pharaoh, and it's an intriguing, personal, human interest story about something that happened, in ancient times. If that's all it is, then we're missing the point. Torah is meant to be studied in a contemporary fashion. Torah is meant to be studied in a way that's relevant and timely and timeless and absolutely speaking to, for the first time I can say this in Torah studies classes, life in 2020. 2020 vision means that Torah is speaking to us today, January 1st, 2020. So the question that we'll put on the table is, so what's the message that you and I can take from Yosef's big reveal, his brother's astonishment, Yosef's kind of placating his brothers and making them feel a little bit better? What can we learn for our lives, our divine service, our spiritual ambitions and successes? What can we take from these passages in Torah? Well, I'm glad you asked. So there's a lot that we can learn. So in order to do this, we're going to begin with a section, with a passage from the Talmud. This is Tractate Chagiga, page 4b. So in Tractate Chagiga on page 4b, there are many sages that are quoted as becoming very emotional when they read certain verses. The Talmud says that when this rabbi read that verse, he sobbed, he became very emotional because it really struck him and it really, really meant something to him. If this is what's said about that person or that concept, what does it mean for us? What does it mean for me? In other words, the Talmud is giving us examples in Chagiga 4b about rabbis who took verses really to heart and who were extremely impacted by those verses. So let's take a look at one such verse, one such rabbi, and the verse that really got him, really dug in deep in a powerful way. So the Talmud, this is text 2. If you have the book, it's on page 178. Talmud says, when Rabbi Elazar reached this verse, he cried. What's the verse? But his brothers could not answer him because they were startled by his presence, which is a verse that we just read. When Yosef first reveals himself to his brothers, the Torah says he asks them, is father still alive? And the Torah says they couldn't even answer. They were so astonished. They were so startled before him. When Rabbi Elazar would read this verse in Torah, he began to cry. He became very emotional. Why? The Talmud continues. Rabbi Elazar said, in explanation of his emotional reaction, if the rebuke of a man of flesh and blood was such that the brothers were unable to respond, when it comes to the rebuke of the Holy One, blessed be he, all the more so. So Rabbi Elazar would cry when he came to this verse. And he explained his tears. He said, if the rebuke of a human being, i.e. Joseph, if the rebuke of a human being is so powerful that it rendered the brothers speechless, there's nothing they could say, how much more so are we going to all be rendered speechless when God Almighty rebukes us for our misdeeds, for our shortcomings? And that really, that kind of meditation, that intention, that kavanah, really got him in a deep way. If the rebuke of a mortal human being has such a powerful impact, how much more so is the rebuke of the divine, of God, in the future time? Now, it's a moving Talmudic passage, and I think the Talmud does a good job explaining why Rabbi Elazar was so impacted emotionally from this verse. Nonetheless, if we really want to analyze it, if we want to take away the fun, if you will, from this Talmudic passage, and instead of looking at it only emotionally, where it's powerful, if we begin to critically analyze it intellectually, it begins to fall apart a little bit. And I'll tell you what I mean. You see, if you look at the exact quote of the Talmud. The Talmud is saying that Rabbi Elazar's reasoning is that if the rebuke of a human being renders the brother speechless, how much more so God's rebuke? Simple question. If we analyze it intellectually, simple question. Where did Yosef rebuke his brothers? We don't find in any of these verses that Joseph rebukes his brothers. All Joseph said initially, right, before, which rendered the brother speechless, all that Joseph said was, Ani Yosef, ha'od avichai. I am Yosef, I am Joseph, his father is still alive. That's all he said. So, where's the rebuke? He doesn't tell them, how dare you? I am Yosef. Do you know what you tried to do to me? Do you know how terrible I felt? Do you know how destructive, devastating it was? He doesn't say that. He doesn't give them a guilt trip. He doesn't mention at all anything about the episode initially. He just says simply, and 2 words, Ani Yosef, I'm Yosef. And 3 more words, Ha'od Avichai, his father is still alive. That's it. And at that point, the brothers can't respond. They're astonished, they're startled, they're just awestruck, dumbstruck. And so Rabbi Elazar says that the rebuke of a human being could cause that reaction. How much more so the rebuke of the divine? And so my question is, where's the rebuke? I don't see any rebuke. Let's take a look at text number 3. Text number 3 is from a Hasidic work called Shem Mishmul. And if you have it in your books, it's on page 179. Otherwise, it is. Otherwise, I'll read it out loud, and you'll listen in. So he writes, seemingly, when Joseph's brothers could not answer him because they were startled by his presence, Joseph hadn't yet mentioned the sale. What then is the meaning of the verse? They were unable to stand before his rebuke. Again, the Talmud is saying that Rabbi Elazar's rationale is that they were so startled by his rebuke, how much more so when God rebukes us. But what rebuke was there? He hadn't, at that point when they were stunned into silence, there was no rebuke. He hadn't said a word in condemnation. And the truth is, even after he mentions that I'm Yosef who you sold into slavery, even after he says that, he says, don't feel bad, don't be upset. God sent me before you to provide for you. It's all good. So where's the rebuke? Again, the question is zeroing in on a very specific choice of phraseology in the Talmud, where the rationale given for Rabbi Elazar's emotional reaction to this verse is because of Joseph's rebuke. If Joseph's rebuke could cause such an impact in his brothers, how much more so God's rebuke? What rebuke? Joseph didn't rebuke them. That's question number 1. Question number 2. You and I might imagine, or you and I might justifiably conclude that the reason why the brothers couldn't say a thing, they were speechless, is because what do you say to someone who you hurt so badly? And yes, he eventually tells them, don't feel bad, don't feel sad, don't feel bad. It all worked out for the best. He eventually did say that. But if you're the brothers, how do you not feel profoundly guilty, profoundly ashamed of your actions? What are you going to say? Sorry? Does sorry cut it? There's no way sorry cuts it. There's no way the word sorry is able to make up for what you did to this young man. Right? Young man, 17 years old, you take him, you throw him into a pit with snakes and scorpions, you pull him out, you sell him as a slave, you essentially abandon him for 2 decades. What are you going to say? Sorry? It was a mistake. Whoops. There's nothing to say. Why? Because you can imagine the hurt that you've caused to this person that's standing in front of you. And again, Yosef Soon thereafter, immediately after they were shocked into silence, he immediately begins to placate them, and he says, don't worry, don't feel sad, don't feel bad, it all worked out. But understand their initial reaction is anticipating or feeling the pain that they caused this young man or this human being and the shame of having caused that. So now the question is, when Rabbi Elazar in the Talmud says that, can you imagine if a human rebuke can cause such a reaction, how much more so a divine rebuke? Now the question is, the second question, first question was what rebuke? Joseph never rebuked them. Second question is, it makes sense to be stunned into silence when you know how much hurt you've caused the other. But can we really say the same thing about God? Even when we mess up, even when we do something that God doesn't want us to do, can we actually say that we're hurting God to the point that we should feel ashamed for hurting God? Are we really hurting God? Can a human being affect God in such a manner that God is actually hurt by our actions? It seems to be the answer seems to be no. So let's read this text 4. Text 4 is coming from a mystical text. This is the Tzemach Tzedek, the third Chabad Rebbe, from his work on Torah called Or HaTorah, which is the light of Torah. Text 4, page 180, if you have it, otherwise listen. At first brush, the rebuke of flesh and blood and the rebuke of the Holy One, blessed be he, are not similar. With the case of Joseph and his brothers, they indeed committed a terrible evil by selling him to Egypt. Therefore, it makes sense that they were shocked by his presence. But in the case of the Holy One, blessed be he, sin does not impact God in any real way, as the verse states. If you are righteous, what do you give him? If your transgressions are many, what do you do to him? Rather, one who sins robs his own soul. As the verse states, destruction is not his, which therefore raises a very, very profound question, as I mentioned before. If we're operating with the premise that God is untouchable, you can't put God in a bad mood. You can't hurt God. God is infinite. How can a finite creature harm God? We can't. If that's our premise, then the comparison, the entire analogy or comparison between the story of Yosef and his brothers and us standing before God falls apart. The brothers couldn't stand before Yosef. They were ashamed of their own shadow, of their own presence before Yosef, knowing how much they've hurt him. But have we hurt God? We haven't hurt God. We can't hurt God. So then are we really feeling shame? Will we really feel shame giving a reckoning before God? Maybe it's a different experience, but it doesn't seem to make sense to say, to use the terminology of shame. Okay, so we have two questions on the Talmudic comparison. So in order to understand this better, let us explore the Kabbalah of the soul. Let's get a better understanding of what souls really are and really are all about. Okay. So in order to do this, we're going to read yet another text. And this text, let's see. Okay, and this text is coming from the book of Tanya. In the book of Tanya, it explains in chapter 19 why it is that the soul is likened to a flame. It says, Ner Hashem Nishmat Adam. The candle or the flame of God is the soul of humankind, which means that there's a comparison, there's a likeness between a neshama, a soul, and a flame. So what's the comparison? Fire, the soul is compared to fire. The question is why? So Kabbalah teaches, and Hasidic philosophy, Chabad Hasidic philosophy explains this at length, that the nature of fire has a very unique property, What is the property of fire? Fire is always about undoing its own existence. Fire is very restless. Fire, if we could say one thing about fire, is it doesn't want to exist and it doesn't want anything else to exist. That's the nature of fire. Fire, quite simply, does not want other things to exist. So you light a piece of paper on fire. You put a flame to a piece of paper. What does the flame do? First of all, it consumes all of the paper, the entire paper. It moves it from a state of existence into non-existence. Now I know, of course, there's a residue, ashes of the paper, but in its original form, that original form, vis-a-vis the form of paper, no longer exists. So fire takes paper and makes paper non-existent, and then when it has nothing else to burn, what happens? It undoes itself. It burns itself out of existence. In other words, again, fire, the nature of fire is to not exist, to not want to exist, to not want others to exist. So whatever you light on fire, it will consume. And when that's done, it will consume itself and it's gone. So scripture says that the soul, and this is referring to the godly soul, not the lower animal or natural soul, but the godly soul is a flame. Why is it a flame? Because just like physical fire wishes to undo itself, deconstruct, and as Kabbalah says, it wishes to go back to its spiritual source, the source of fire, which is ethereal fire, but not physical fire. So it wants to remove itself from the physical plane of existence. The same thing is true with the soul. The nature of the soul, the divine soul, not the animal soul. The animal soul loves to exist. The nature of the divine soul is non-existence. The divine soul does not want to exist in independent, unique, self-contained form. What does it want? To go back to its source, to be subsumed within the source of its flame, i.e., God. So again, just like fire is looking to get out and go back, the soul is looking to get out and go back. Which is why, by the way, when you take a candle, we're just coming from the holiday of Hanukkah, so we've all had lots of experience with this over the last week and a half or so. When you take a fire, when you take a candle and you hold it straight, so the flame points up, which indicates that it's yearning for its source. You take the candle and you tip it to the side. Guess what? The flame is still going to be going up. You turn the candle upside down. The flame is still going to be pointing up. Why? Because it always seeks to go back to its source. And to do that, it eliminates whatever is holding it down so that it can get out. The soul has a similar nature. All it wants is to undo itself and go home, go back to God. But of course, it's not so simple. You see, the soul, the godly soul, has a purpose, has a mission. And its mission is to make the world a brighter and warmer place. Let's use the example of fire. Fire, the flame wants to go, but if you put oil and a wick, it's going to stay. And while it stays, it's going to produce heat and light. The soul, the godly soul, has a very similar construct. By its own nature, it wants to go. Its purpose is to stay and to do what? To create light and warmth, to make the world a brighter, more divine, more godly, more spiritual, more warm, more loving place. So the soul is put into a cold and dark world, and it's told, illuminate, warm up, make this a better place. What's the fuel? The fuel, of course, is Torah and mitzvot. It's the good deeds that we do, and the wick is the body. The point is, the soul's flame on its own wishes to go up, but its purpose is to be tethered for as long as it's here and to create warmth and light in this physical world. Let's take a look at text 5. If you have it, it's 181. If not, listen up. Let us examine the verse which states, the soul of a person is a candle of God. This is Tanya chapter 19. This means that the souls of the Jewish people who are called person are like the flame of a candle, whose nature is to constantly flicker upward. For the flame of the fire naturally seeks to part from the wick and to unite with its source above. Though it would thereby be extinguished, this is what it naturally desires. So too, the soul of a Jew naturally desires and yearns to separate itself and depart from the body and to unite with its origin and source in God. Blessed be he who is the source of all life. Though it would thereby become null and not, and its identity would be nullified there with nothing at all remaining of its original self, this is its natural will and desire. Again, Tanya says very explicitly, very clearly, the nature of the soul. If you were to ask the soul, what do you want? It would say, I don't want to be here. I'd rather be with God. I'd rather be with God and not exist. I'd rather to return and become part of God and lose my own identity as a unique soul rather than remain where I am. But of course, the soul is not necessarily asked if it wants to be here. The soul is given a mission, and it does its mission faithfully. And its mission is, again, to create light and warmth here on earth by doing Torah and mitzvot. Fantastic. Which sets up the following understanding. What happens when a person takes their divine soul that wants nothing more than to touch God, to reunite with God, is only here in order to make the world a brighter, better, warmer place through Torah and mitzvot? What happens when we take that soul and we put it inside a jail cell and lock the door? What happens when we take a box and unceremoniously close up our soul? It's a fundamental Jewish belief that the soul can never be extinguished. The flame of the soul never goes out. But what if a person chooses to cover up their own soul, to not give it its expression, to not give it oxygen? It'll still burn without oxygen. But what happens if we choose to put it in exile, to put it in a cage and lock the key, lock the door and throw away the key? What happens then? Text number 6 from Tanya once again. There is no greater exile than the soul being dragged by the body into a state of sin. Again, I just want to explain what he's saying. There is no greater concept of exile. Exile meaning being in a place where you don't want to be, forced to do something you don't want to do, and not being able to do what you do want to do. There's no greater exile that exists on planet Earth than the exile of the soul in the body when the body doesn't let the soul do what it wants to do. It is a plunge from a lofty roof to a deep pit. It came from the highest of heights, the soul did, and now it's in the lowest of the low. To translate this into simple terms, we'll get back to inside. We're not done with the quote, but I want to translate it to simple terms. The soul is lofty. It wants God. It wants to make the world a brighter place. Well, that's its mission. It needs to do that. It doesn't have time for other stuff, other mishigasin, crazy things, activities. And yet, what do? Often, we're running after materialism, running after food and other pleasures, and running after money, and running after work, and running after things that objectively don't have much meaning or value. How does the soul feel? Here you have a soul that's a piece of God. You have a soul, Ner Hashem Nishmat Adam. You have a soul, a candle, a flame of God. Where's the soul? Where's the soul? I'll tell you where it is. It's exiled. It's exiled inside the body, inside the actions that we're taking at that moment. Back inside. For as explained earlier, the root of all Jewish souls is in the divine wisdom, and God and his wisdom are one and the same. Listen to this example that he gives. It is akin to one who seizes the king's head, drags it down, and dips his face in a privy, which means toilet, full of filth. The ultimate humiliation, even if one does it only for a moment. For as is known, the klipot and sitrachah, meaning the dark force, the dark spiritual forces in the universe, are called vomit and filth. Imagine you take the king's head and you push it down into a toilet that's not a clean toilet. Can you imagine the humiliation, the pain, the agony, the disgrace that's taking place? The Alter Rebbe Tanya says, the founder of Chabad says, in a similar fashion, every time we choose to do something that's not aligned with our higher mission, that's not aligned with the values of our divine soul, what we're doing is we're taking that soul that is a piece of God and we're pulling it into a place of filth, a place of vomit, a place of filth, a place of waste, into a disgusting place. And by moving the soul there, we're also moving on some level God there as well. So that's what happens. That's what happens when we become out of alignment. You know, there's the back can be out of alignment, the physiology, bone structure, skeletal structure of a human being, of the human body can be out of alignment, and our spiritual lives can be out of alignment. And out of alignment spiritually means this. It means that we're going through our lives, we're going through our days, our weeks, our months, our years, and we're not hitting our purpose. We're existing, but we're not living. We're existing as bodies and animal souls, but we're not living and giving fuel to our divine soul. We're not allowing the divine soul to flicker up and create warmth and create light in this world. And by not allowing the soul to do what it needs to do, what it wants to do, we are in essence locking it up and dragging it into a place of filth. So by understanding this, we have a completely different insight into the nature of sin and the nature of Joseph's reunion with his brothers. What's the nature of sin? Why is sin bad? It's bad simply because it means that we're taking our soul and degrading it, humiliating it, keeping it away from its purpose. We're locking it up and throwing away the key. Doesn't mean, by the way, that we can't reclaim it through teshuvah. Of course we can, but it means at least temporarily we are harming the soul. And now we understand the direct parallel between that and what Joseph's brothers did to him. Joseph's brothers took him. They took him and they threw him into a pit. Then they took him out of a pit and they sold him into slavery. That's what we call exile. You take a human being and you put them in a place where they can't be free. That is exile. Joseph was exiled by his brothers. So what happens 20 years later? 20 years later, they stand before him. And Joseph says to them the simple words, Ani Yosef, I am Joseph. And what do they say? There's nothing they can say. There's absolutely nothing they can say. Why? Because they are hit with the full brunt force of their actions. They took an innocent, a righteous young man, 17 years old, and what did they do? They heartlessly sold him into slavery. They exiled him. Seeing this young man become an adult and now recognizing his greatness, how he rose to such prominence, how he wasn't just a little kid with dreams, but he was somebody eminently talented and qualified. Seeing that, and of course, seeing also the spirituality of Yosef, they're rendered speechless. What did they do to their brother? What did they do to his soul? That they sent him away. They sent him into exile. They locked him away. And so now we understand the parallel that the Talmud brings. Rabbi Elazar, when he came to this verse, he would cry. If the rebuke of Yosef could astonish the brothers, how much more so God's rebuke? And we asked before, what rebuke? Yosef never rebuked them. The mere vision of Yosef, merely seeing Yosef in front of them, that itself was a rebuke. What's the rebuke? How could you do this to your own brother? How can you do this to a young man with so much potential? How could you do this simply to another human being? And what Rabbi Elazar is saying in the Talmud is, at a certain point, whether it's after 120 years after we pass on, or whether we can make that choice today, when we stand before God and our own soul, and we make a proper accounting, a cheshbon nefesh, an introspective accounting, and we recognize that we have a soul that has incredible gifts, that is incredibly lofty, and we look at the soul and we see what we've done to it, that should shock us and render us speechless. Just like Yosef's brothers were rendered speechless, confronting the full brunt of their actions, Rabbi Elazar is saying that we too are rendered speechless when we recognize the effect, the devastating effects that our actions might have on our own soul, and by proxy on God himself. We asked before that God can't be affected, but the peace of God that's inside of us, that is connected with its source, with God, that can be affected. At least it could be exiled. And so the message of the Talmud is, when we recognize that we have a soul, we recognize that we have a pure soul that's a piece of God that only seeks to return, to be one with God, and that it's here on a mission to make the world a brighter and warmer place. And then we think about what are we doing to the soul? Are we allowing the soul to live? Are we allowing the soul to express itself, to become one with God, to make the world a brighter place? Or are we schlepping it around into who knows where? That thought process itself should shock us and wake us up and inspire us to commit to never selling out our soul ever again. Rabbi Elazar, when he came to this verse, cried because it hit him in a deep place. It wasn't just a story about Yosef and his brothers. It was his story. It was our story. For you and me, it's our story today in January 1st, 2020. What's the story? The story is you and I have a soul, a divine soul. All it wants is to be one with God. And as it's here, all it wants is to do a mitzvah. And when we allow it to do a mitzvah, we're keeping the soul free. And when we move it away from a mitzvah and we move it into untoward behavior, what we're doing is we're selling our Joseph, our Yosef. We're selling out. Why do we sell out? Because we don't realize it's a Yosef. We forget that we have a soul. Rabbi Elazar is telling us, remember the story. When you realize that you have a Yosef, that you have a Joseph, you won't be able to sell him. When you and I realize, not just intellectually, but when we feel that we have a divine peace inside of us, we won't even come to that state of exiling our soul. Okay. I want to read this text. Text number 9, again from the Shem Mishmul, page 186. Otherwise, listen in. When they saw Joseph's countenance, they were automatically stunned due to the shame of recognizing their wrongdoing. Therefore, though Joseph didn't say a thing to them, they were ashamed. Again, he's just explaining that Joseph didn't have to say anything. Just his mention, Ani Yosef, just him saying, I am Joseph, that was enough to bring shame upon them. Why? Because they realized what they had done. Likewise, he says, and this was the point that we're making, when a person is shown who they are and how great their soul is and how they have damaged it in this world, how can they not be ashamed? In reality, if one were to know and recognize their true worth, i.e., that they are not merely flesh and blood, but rather they recognize the greatness of the soul, they would never sin. The Shem Mishmul says, if you and I were to know, not know up here, but know here in the heart, to really know, to get that we have this peace of God inside of us, we not only would we never sin, we could never sin. I mean, how can we sell out our soul like that? How can we imprison our soul? How can you take such a pure piece of God and put it into such a painful and humiliating experience? We could never do such a thing. All of this is step number 1. There's another piece of the story. Again, understanding this, the first piece of the story is the timeless message of Yosef's revelation to his brothers is, Yosef says, I am Yosef. With those words, they're stunned. And when we see our soul, whether it's in this lifetime or after we pass on, but when we see our soul, if we put it into compromising positions, we are stunned as well. And knowing this should inspire us to lift it up. But there's still one more piece of the story. After the brothers are astonished and shocked and ashamed, Yosef says to them, listen up. I am Yosef, who you sold into slavery. That's true. But know this, I was not sold by you. I was sent by God to provide for you. And Yosef radically flips the script. This too is a message for you and I. What's the message? Why is it that Yosef was not angry at his brothers? On a simple level, we can say that Yosef was really practicing the Jewish value, the Torah value of not taking revenge nor holding a grudge. There's 2 different prohibitions in Torah. One says don't take revenge, which means if someone does something bad to you, don't do the same thing back to them. That's one prohibition, revenge. But there's another prohibition, which is holding a grudge. Holding a grudge is a little bit different. It means, as Rambam explains, Maimonides explains, if you ask a neighbor to borrow something and they say no, and then they come to you next week and ask to borrow something of yours, so taking revenge would be to say, I'm not going to lend you my thing because you didn't lend me your thing. That's mirroring their behavior, which is not okay. Bearing a grudge would be to say, I will give you what you want, unlike you who didn't give it to me. So that mention of I'm not going to do what you did to me. And what you did to me still bothers me. But I'm going to be the better person. I'm going to take the high road. So did you lend it to them? You lent it to them. But you're still holding on to a grudge. That's also prohibited in Torah. So the Torah tells us, first of all, no payback. And number 2, not even no payback. Don't even hold that grudge. By the way, you should know this is very sound psychological and emotional advice, because as we know, holding on to resentment is like drinking poison and hoping the other person's going to die. Ultimately, holding on to grudges and resentments, first and foremost, pains ourselves and hurts ourselves. It's self-destructive. So that's just good human advice. Yosef, though, takes it a step further, which we'll talk about in a moment. But here's the interesting thing. Yosef is of the perspective that everything that happens is coming from Hashem. He doesn't give power to the brother's decision to sell him into slavery. What he says is, it's not about you, it's about me, and it's about Hashem. Well, that sounds, it's not arrogant, it's about me. It's really about Hashem's plan. It's about God's plan. And he says to them clearly, you didn't sell me. It wasn't about you and slavery in Egypt. God sent me here to get food for you, to provide for you. So on a simple level, we could say that Yosef really took this no holding grudges and no revenge really to the extreme. Really, not only is he not holding a grudge and taking revenge, but he's totally cool with the whole situation. But there's something even deeper here at play, and that is Yosef didn't look at it as something bad that happened to him that ended up being okay or working out for the better. He looked at it as from the beginning, from the moment he came down to Egypt, it was already part of his shlichut, part of his mission, divinely ordained mission to be the provider for his family and for the Jewish people. And ultimately, really, to lead them into Egyptian exile and then to leave with great wealth. He looked at it from the beginning that it was all part of the plan. You see, there's two ways to look at adversity. One way is, well, there's more than two ways, but two ways to positively look at adversity. One way is it's bad, it's difficult, it's tough, but it's going to lead to something great. Yosef had an even deeper perspective. Not that it's bad, it's difficult, it's horrible, but it's going to lead to something positive. From the beginning, his perspective was, it is good. It's a mission. It's a shlichut. God is sending me to Egypt for a purpose, and I'm accomplishing. I have a roadmap in front of me, and I have what to accomplish right here. This is a completely different level of dealing with adversity. It's not bad that's going to be good. It's all part of the upward journey. Even as he's going down into Egypt, in his mind and in his heart and his soul, he's going up. And this reveals an even deeper truth about confronting our own shortcomings. Step one of confronting our own shortcomings, we said before, is to recognize that we have a beautiful, pure, pristine soul. So let's not sell it out. Let's not put it into a pit or sell it to the Egyptians. But if we've compromised on some level our own divine truths, what should we do then? The Torah is telling us the second message of Yosef. And that is, recognize that wherever you are right now, even if it's your own choices that got you here, it's all part of the upward journey. It doesn't mean, by the way, very importantly, actually, I should say, it's not by the way, it doesn't mean that I should continue to make spiritually questionable choices. No, what it means is that when I recognize that I have a soul, and I recognize that I have a divine purpose, and I recognize I've been locking up my soul, at the moment that I begin to feel bad, I need to tell myself the second message of Joseph, and that is, this too is part of the divinely ordained journey. Even though it's been chosen by a human being, namely myself, but this I believe and I trust is part of the journey. Where I am today is a direct result of all of my choices, both good and the opposite, and my unique circumstances today. Who I am, where I am, who I'm with, etc. All of these unique circumstances are all there for me right now to make the next majestic choice and to provide, as Joseph did, food, but really light and warmth to my environs and to the larger world as well. And this is the beautiful dual message of the story of Yosef's revelation to his brothers. Number one, upon seeing truth and our inner truth, we should be shocked and we should be woken up from whatever it is that we're doing to compromise that inner truth of our soul. That's point number one. Point number two is, at the very next moment, let's recognize that no matter what we've done, it's all been part of the journey to get us right where we are and to lead us ever upward and onward. We should never beat ourselves up so badly. And what I mean, of course, by this is internally, beat ourselves up for our decisions that we become paralyzed by shame, guilt, and regret. We're rather meant to recognize that we need to pivot and then recognize that whatever happened is part of my story and part of this elevatory experience. How can I justify where I've been by elevating it up to a greater place than could have been done had I not made these choices that I made? So in the final analysis, we are called upon to commit to giving our soul all of the expression that it needs and commit to making the world a brighter and better place. And at the same time, we're called upon to recognize that no matter what we've done or where we've been, it can all be elevated in our journey and be a part of our story in making this world a better place. Thank you very much for joining me tonight for Torah Studies Live. Wishing everybody many blessings and many opportunities to really live with our soul, with our divine soul, and many opportunities to see the depth of all of our choices and to find and to figure out a way, to discover the way to turn that darkness perhaps into the greatest light. Thank you for joining me. Have a good night. Lots of blessings.